In horror writing this week, we're looking at plotting through the form of a flash fiction. Particularly, we'll look at a couple stories, one by Angela Carter, one by H.P. Lovecraft, that are kind of short stories. And Carter's plays a very, very short fiction, just over a page long, basically. This form that I call flash fiction is also known by many names. It can be called minute fiction or sudden fiction or microfiction or short fiction. But it's basically a story told within a page or two, a complete story, not a summarization in a sense, but a story that is boiled down to its essential point of conflict. When we think about flash fiction as a form, you have to kind of distinguish it from the more linear and developed sequence of events in a short story. You don't have much space to develop character here. You don't have much space to set up and explore a conflict. You don't have, kind of a wider plotted space to develop the story, and you have to go right to the central elements of the story itself. In a way, it's kind of perhaps closer to a prose poem, or where there's a burst of an image or a particular moment that impacts the reader. This can also be kind of seen as being close to Edgar Allan Poe's thought that fiction, short fiction in particular, should aim for a singular effect, and Poe's short stories all attempt to do this, right? That the Poe story attempts to make the reader feel the effect of horror or shock or surprise as it unfolds. I think it's particularly pointed here for the flash fiction. Is what do you make the reader feel in that last sentence, in that last word, in that last sound that's on the page? So you have to kind of focus on the moment, the scene, the image, or the feeling as you write. Joyce Carol Oates, also a writer of some horror tales, says of flash fiction that very short fictions are nearly always experimental, exquisitely calibrated, and reminiscent of Robert Frost's definition of a poem, a structure of words that consumes itself as it unfolds, like ice melting on a stove. I think a couple things to note here from Oates' perspective, right, is that these are stories that are experimental. They find their own ways of being told, right? So you've worked so far in kind of plotting short stories. You've read short stories, but now, how can you, take fiction and boil it down to what's essential to it? Also note that these are calibrated, right? So these are the stories that kind of require a little bit more time to kind of rethink your focus as a writer and what you're attempting to do on that page. You can think about it maybe like as a canvas, right? That you're a painter looking at a canvas. Instead, you're a story writer looking at the blank page. You only have that much space. How do you intend to tell your story within the focus of that page? Bonnie Jo Campbell, whose story Sleepover is available on Canvas. She says, it's only a page long. A student once asked her, how long did it take you to write that? And she said 13 years. And so, the sense in which the story gets told, it's deceptive. That the small space of the storytelling, may require you more time, perhaps, than it would to unwind a story of 5 to 10 pages, perhaps. When you read and write flash fictions, a couple things to think about here as a writer. Number one, avoid simple summarization of a larger story, right? So you don't want to just try to retell something that took years in one page. You want to focus on a specific moment that kind of typifies or represents the center of that story. So within microfiction, narrate a defined moment here. Like I say, one that's representative in some ways. If you think about this as a prose poem, you can focus on how the image that's set up or the language that's used invokes a feeling for the reader. What feeling are you trying to make the reader feel? Is it, in what ways does the horror tale perhaps try to invoke shock or surprise or horror itself here? Again, work with that space of one page. I'm asking you to write a fiction within 250 words, basically one double-spaced page. How does that work as a space of confinement in a way, and how does that confinement push you to rethink the possibilities of what you can tell within that one page? And you can also adapt known stories here, like fairy tales within flash form, as Carter does with The Snow Child. An example here again is Bonnie Jo Campbell's Sleepover, where she takes the story of Frankenstein and kind of readapts it and adapts it to how does a teenage girl begin to feel herself as quote unquote monster as she watches the film. So the story on the table here is Angela Carter's Snow Child. As you read the piece, kind of rethink the singular effect that the story invokes for you as a reader. Do you feel the coldness of the story? It opens in a snowy landscape. Do the events as they unwind make you feel a certain coldness as well? Do you feel a sharpness of desire or envy as the characters interact within the story? And is there a moment in the story where you are horrified as you read? Think about the visual imagery here. In what ways is Carter kind of perhaps thinking through this as a prose poem, right? As she says, the whole world was white. How do the physical images, the colors that are invoked on the page, in what ways do they impact your sense of feeling as a reader? And also think about the effect on you as a reader, this small space, and what ways does it perhaps cause you to rethink the simplicity of storytelling? Particularly, how does Carter overturn the simplicity of the fairy tale here as form, right? Once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after. She uses fairy tale elements here. In what ways does this story make you rethink the simplicity of the fairy tales or the myths that you've grown up with, from childhood on? So the story itself, just to summarize, begins midwinter, invincible, and immaculate. So from the very beginning, you have this, sense of coldness to the story, this cleanness to the story, these sharp colors and sharp feelings that the characters are, that define the characters' worlds here. And you have a count and countess out for a ride, and the count says, "I wish I had a girl as red as blood, as black as that bird's feather." As he calls this girl up, the countess sees her and has simply one thought: how shall I be rid of her? So from the very beginning, right, you have this girl that's conjured by the count's desire. The Snow Child is the count's imagination made into flesh, and she has a sharpness to her that the countess envies. That she has the count's attention and his desire. Again, the countess envies this, and how does that cause the events of the story to play themselves out? The girl here, the Snow Child, is a conjured object, right? That she kind of steps out of the count's desire in a way. She's marked by her white skin, red mouth, black hair, and stands stark naked in front of these two. And as she stands, the count kind of basically covers her with the countess's gloves, the countess's furs, and the countess's boots. So the girl takes the things that mark the countess as being special to the count here in this. And then comes the moment of conflict, where, or shock perhaps, where they come to this bush of roses, and this is kind of conjured perhaps in the countess's imagination, and the girl herself is ordered to pick one of the flowers, and as she does, she pricks her finger on the thorn, bleeds, screams, and falls dead. When she falls dead, the count is shocked, and he goes to the girl, but instead of taking her up, he immediately attempts to have sex with her. He violates her body, and as he does, in a moment that's shocking in the text, right, she begins to melt around him. And all that's left on the snow at the end of the story is this leftover rose that's there, which he picks up and then hands back to the Countess. And when the Countess takes it in her hand, she's pricked by the thorn, and she screams, "It bites!" And that's the end of the story. That's the last thing that you're left with within Carter's tale. How do you respond to this? As a reader, what ways do you respond emotionally, and how does the language in this story, open your interpretation of it? For Margaret Atwood, who you might know as the writer of the novel The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood reads this story like other stories in the Bloody Chamber. She sees this as a brief fable for Carter, where blood kills the girl since she is only an idea of virginal perfection which cannot survive actual passion. Through the folk tale as form, Carter constructs a new woman in the mode of irony. So what you have here, right, is a fairy tale that's been boiled down to its essential elements, right? The elements of desire, of conflict, of envy, of want. And Carter uses those basic elements to shock you as a reader by showing you these kind of basic elemental human interactions. How those come out of desire, how those come out of envy, and how we as human beings kind of conjure the things of our lives through those basic feelings. The question is, right, two questions really. Number one, how do you see the emergent snow child in a way, right? Is how, she's conjured by the Count's desire. She is put to death through the Countess's envy. In what ways does this new woman emerge here, in Carter's telling? In what ways do you see the kinds of myths and the kinds of stories that define women's roles and women's perspectives? What ways are those overturned by Carter's storytelling here? And then secondly as well, in what ways does Carter's story cause you to rethink, the basic elements of fairy tales overall? In what ways are they much more perhaps complicated than what you had assumed, when you heard Once Upon a Time? In what ways do those basic interactions of the story tale, or the fairy tale, or the story itself reflect much more complex human feelings and interactions, particularly your interaction and feeling upon reading The Snow Child? Look forward to reading your own attempts with flash fiction this week. Thanks. If you have any questions, please let me know.